HOA Karen cut down $250,000 tree on my property. Sues me when it destroys her car. Let me tell you about the oak tree in my backyard. To most people, it's just a tree, a massive, sprawling oak with roots so deep they probably reach the molten core of the earth. To me, though, it's the soul of my home. I'd even go as far as to say it's the reason my wife Amber and I bought this house 8 years ago. We're Ryan and Amber, and if you'd asked us back then, we'd have described ourselves as your average couple chasing the dream of homeownership. I'm an environmental consultant, which is really just a fancy way of saying I try to help cities and companies not wreck the planet while making their buildings more energy efficient. Amber is a freelance graphic designer, the type of person who can make a living room look like it belongs in a magazine spread without breaking a sweat. Together, we make a good team. Her creativity and my practicality keep life interesting. When we stumbled upon this house in a quiet Denver suburb, we were sold the moment we stepped into the backyard. That oak tree was a giant, ancient sentinel, its canopy shading the entire yard and giving the place a kind of serene magic. The realtor threw around phrases like historical charm and natural beauty, but all I could think was, this tree is perfect. For Amber, it was love at first sight, too. The house itself needed work. Sure, but the backyard? She was already picturing string lights, a patio for hosting summer dinners, and the oak as the centerpiece of it all. Within a month, we were homeowners, newlyweds, and ready to build our life around that tree. The neighborhood on the surface was exactly what we wanted. Tree-lined streets, pristine sidewalks, and neighbors who waved as they walked their dogs. It's the kind of place you'd see in a Hallmark movie, minus the dramatic plot twists. It didn't take long to realize that the idyllic charm came with a price. The HOA. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-HOA in principle. They keep the place looking nice, and I get that people don't want their neighbor turning their lawn into a junkyard. But some of the rules? Over the top. You can't have your trash can visible for more than 3 hours on collection day. Your grass has to be cut to exactly 3 inches. And heaven forbid you plant anything that isn't a perfect square of Kentucky bluegrass. That last one became the first point of tension between us and the HOA, or, more specifically, between us and Karen. Karen, the HOA president, is the type of person who takes her title way too seriously. She's in her late 40s, divorced, and from what I've gathered, being in charge of the HOA is her entire personality. I'll give her credit for one thing. She's dedicated. The woman knows every rule, every bylaw, and every loophole, and she enforces them with the enthusiasm of a drill sergeant. Our first run-in with Karen happened about a year after we moved in. I'd spent months transforming a patch of our front yard into a native wildflower garden. A mix of coneflowers, milkweed, and yarrow designed to attract bees and butterflies. I thought it was beautiful. Karen thought it was a messy weed patch. She left a strongly worded note in our mailbox, citing some obscure HOA rule about neighborhood harmony and demanding we replace it with traditional grass. But here's the thing about me. I don't back down when I know I'm right. I combed through the HOA guidelines, highlighting every line that supported my case. When I presented it to Karen at the next HOA meeting, she gave me a tight-lipped smile that I can only describe as the beginning of a vendetta. My wildflowers stayed, but from that day on, I knew Karen wasn't a fan of mine. The oak tree, though, that's where things started to get personal. This isn't just any tree. It was planted in 1912 as part of Denver's Arbor Day celebrations, back when the city was embracing the City Beautiful movement. Mayor Robert Speer, a visionary for urban beauty, had spearheaded the initiative, encouraging homeowners to plant trees that would transform Denver's dusty streets into shaded, inviting spaces. Over the years, that tree survived everything. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, when droughts killed off countless others. Blizzards that snapped branches like matchsticks. Even the urban expansion of the 1950s and 60s, when developers bulldozed older trees to make way for cookie-cutter houses. Our oak stood tall through it all, its roots burrowing deep, its branches stretching wide. At over 110 years old, it's one of the last remaining original trees in the neighborhood, a living piece of history. To me, that oak is a symbol of resilience. It's weathered storms, literal and figurative, and it's still here, providing shade and oxygen and a sense of timelessness. Amber sees it as more than that, though. She calls it our muse. She's done entire photo shoots with the tree as a backdrop, capturing how the sunlight filters through its leaves. We've hosted barbecues under its canopy, hung a swing from one of its sturdy branches, and spent countless evenings just sitting on the patio, marveling at how lucky we are to have it. Apparently, not everyone shares our love for the tree. Karen, for reasons I still don't fully understand, decided the oak was a problem. It started with offhand comments. She'd walk by during one of her routine neighborhood inspections. Yes, she does those, and say things like, "That tree's getting awfully big, isn't it?" Or, "Old trees can be dangerous." One strong windstorm and down they go. At first, I brushed it off as typical Karen behavior. But then she started bringing it up at HOA meetings. "I think we need to have a discussion about large aging trees in the neighborhood," she announced at one meeting, her eyes darting in my direction. "They can pose serious safety risks. Imagine the damage if one of those fell on a house, or worse, a person." I could feel Amber stiffen beside me. "Are you referring to our tree?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Karen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh no, of course not. I'm just speaking generally. But it's something we should all think about." That was the beginning of her campaign against the oak. She started spreading rumors, telling neighbors that the tree was unstable and could fall at any moment. She even went as far as to suggest we were endangering the entire community by keeping it. The absurdity of it all would have been laughable if it wasn't so frustrating. Our tree was perfectly healthy. I'd had it inspected by an arborist when we first moved in, and again a few years later just to be sure. Both times, the verdict was the same. The oak was in excellent condition and posed no risk. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. This wasn't about the tree. It was about control. And I had no idea just how far she was willing to go to get it. The first time I realized Karen wasn't just being petty, but was actively scheming to get rid of our oak tree, was when I overheard her chatting with a few neighbors during her morning inspection walk. She stood on the sidewalk just outside our house, her voice loud enough to make sure I could hear through the open kitchen window. "It's not just an eyesore," she said, gesturing at the tree with a coffee mug in hand. "It's a ticking time bomb. The roots are probably under their foundation by now, and one bad storm," she clapped her hands together for dramatic effect, "it's coming down. What if it lands on your roof? Or worse, on your kids while they're playing outside?" Her audience nodded uncertainly, stealing glances at the tree as though it might lunge at them. I leaned on the counter, gripping my coffee mug, my pulse ticking up. Karen had already tried and failed to strong-arm me into ripping out my native garden. But this felt different. More deliberate. More insidious. A week later, she escalated her campaign. I came home from a meeting downtown to find a folded paper stuffed under our front doormat. A copy of an arborist report. It claimed the tree was suffering from severe internal rot and was at imminent risk of falling. According to the document, the tree should be removed as soon as possible to prevent catastrophic failure, except I hadn't hired an arborist. The report was riddled with typos and lacked any credentials for the supposed expert who'd written it. A quick Google search confirmed what I already suspected. The arborist didn't exist. Karen had either written it herself or hired someone shady to do it for her. Amber was furious when I showed her the report. "She's crossing a line," she said, pacing the living room. "This is fraud, Ryan. This harassment." She wasn't wrong, but I figured confronting Karen head-on would only make things worse. So instead, I doubled down on my own research. I reached out to 2 certified arborists and scheduled separate inspections. Both reports came back clear. The oak was in excellent health and posed no danger to anyone. I thought that would be the end of it. I underestimated Karen's determination. Over the next month, Karen turned up the pressure. She made the tree the focus of every HOA meeting, citing her fraudulent report as evidence. She claimed multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about their safety, and even accused me of negligence for not addressing the problem. The thing was, Karen had a way of making people believe her. She spoke with the confidence of someone who was absolutely convinced they were right. And for a lot of neighbors, especially those who didn't know me or Amber well, That was enough. Soon, I started noticing sidelong glances when I walked the dog. People would cross the street to avoid the oak's shadow, shaking their heads like it was some sort of death trap. A couple of parents even stopped letting their kids play on the sidewalk near our house. Amber was livid. "She's turning the whole neighborhood against us," she said one night as we sat under the oak's canopy, string lights glowing softly above us. "It's like some kind of witch hunt." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. The worst happened on a Tuesday. I'd been working from home, going over a client's sustainability plan, when I heard the unmistakable hum of heavy machinery. At first, I thought it was someone down the street, maybe a neighbor trimming their hedges or fixing up their yard. But when the sound didn't fade, I got up to check. As I stepped out onto the porch, my heart dropped. A tree-cutting truck was parked halfway up our driveway, and a crew of workers was already in the backyard. My heart dropped as I stepped off the porch and sprinted to the backyard. The sound of the machinery grew louder with every step. When I rounded the corner, my worst fears were confirmed. A crew of workers stood around the oak, one of them revving a chainsaw. They'd already started cutting into its base. A gash about a foot deep marred the trunk, sap bleeding from the wound like an open wound. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. The man with the chainsaw turned to me, looking startled. "We were hired by the HOA president," he said, gesturing toward a clipboard with Karen's name scrawled at the bottom. "She said the tree was a danger and needed to come down immediately." "She doesn't have that authority," I snapped, snatching the clipboard. "This is private property. You need my permission to touch this tree." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. "She gave us an arborist report," one of them said. "Said it was an emergency." "That report is fake," I said, my voice rising. "And now you've damaged the tree." Before I could say more, Karen arrived, marching into the backyard like she owned the place. She wore her usual self-satisfied smirk, but it faltered when she saw me standing there. "Ryan," she said, her tone clipped, "this is for the safety of the neighborhood." "The tree—" "Don't even start, Karen," I interrupted. "This tree is perfectly healthy, and you know it. You've overstepped your authority." Karen's face flushed. "I have a responsibility to protect this community," she shot back. "You've refused to address the risks, so I took action. By hiring a crew to trespass on my property?" I said, my voice shaking with anger. "This is illegal, Karen. You've destroyed a healthy tree, and you're going to be held accountable." We stood there, glaring at each other, while the crew awkwardly shuffled to the side. Then, as if the tree had been waiting for its moment, the air filled with an ominous creaking sound. Everyone froze. The gash in the tree's trunk was deeper than I'd realized, and the massive oak was starting to lean. The creaking grew louder, branches rustling as the entire tree shifted. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing Amber's arm and pulling her back. The crew scrambled toward the driveway, Karen stumbling after them. With a deafening crack, the oak toppled. Time seemed to slow as it fell, its massive branches crashing through the air like thunder. It landed with a final, shuddering impact, directly on top of Karen's Mercedes convertible. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of leaves settling and Karen's sharp intake of breath. Her car was flattened, its roof crumpled like a soda can under the weight of the trunk. Karen let out a scream, somewhere between rage and despair. "My car!" she shrieked, turning on me with wild eyes. "This is your fault. You knew the tree was dangerous, and you let this happen." I was too stunned to respond. Amber, however, had no such hesitation. "Are you kidding me, Karen?" she snapped. "This happened because you hired these guys to cut into the tree without our permission. You caused this." Karen shouted, "You will pay for this." Without waiting for a response, she stormed out of the backyard. The crew, clearly unnerved by what had just happened, quickly packed up their equipment without saying much. Amber, ever the pragmatist, was already documenting everything on her phone. Video footage of the damaged tree, the gash in its trunk, and Karen's crushed car still pinned beneath the branches. Once everyone had cleared out, Amber and I stood there in silence, taking in the wreckage. The oak's massive trunk sprawled across the yard, its branches splayed out like a fallen giant. Karen's car was a total loss, its roof flattened under the weight of the tree. But the worst wasn't over, not by a long shot. Just when I thought we might get a moment to grieve the loss, Karen launched the next phase of her vendetta. Days after the collapse, I came home to find a thick stack of legal documents waiting in my mailbox. Karen was suing me for negligence, claiming that I'd knowingly allowed a dangerous tree to remain on my property, which she argued led to the destruction of her beloved Mercedes convertible. Amber and I stared at the papers in disbelief. "She cut into the tree herself," Amber said, pacing the living room. "How can she sue you for something she caused?" "It's Karen," I muttered. "She's not going to let this go without a fight." My first call was to our insurance company. They assured me they'd handle it and immediately launched an investigation. Within days, they hired an independent arborist to assess what remained of the oak. The findings were exactly what I'd expected. The tree had been perfectly healthy until the crew's unauthorized cuts destabilized it. Karen's actions, not mine, had caused the collapse. That should have been the end of it. But Karen, true to form, refused to back down. The lawsuit dragged on for months, during which time Karen's true colors started to shine through. Depositions were scheduled, and both sides presented their evidence. When Karen took the stand for her deposition, it was clear she didn't anticipate how thorough my defense team had been. The first crack in her story came when she was questioned about the fraudulent arborist report she'd used to justify the tree removal. Karen admitted she had hired someone who wasn't certified, claiming she didn't know they weren't qualified. But under pressure from my attorney, she let slip that she'd specifically sought out someone who would support her narrative. "I didn't think it fit the neighborhood aesthetic," she said at one point, her voice rising with frustration. "That tree was too big, too old, and it overshadowed everything else. It just didn't belong." That statement was the nail in the coffin. It was no longer about safety or liability. It was about Karen's obsession with control and conformity. She didn't care about the neighborhood's well-being. She cared about getting her way. As the case unfolded, other neighbors came forward with their own stories about Karen. One resident testified that Karen had fined her for having unauthorized garden gnomes on her porch. Another spoke about how Karen had tried to shut down a kid's lemonade stand, claiming it violated HOA rules about temporary structures. The most damning testimony came from a former HOA board member who admitted that Karen had often manipulated rules to target residents she didn't like. She would bend the bylaws to suit her agenda, the board member said. It was all about maintaining control. By the time the depositions wrapped up, even the HOA board had distanced themselves from Karen. They released a statement condemning her actions, calling them a gross misuse of authority, and affirming that the HOA had no role in the tree's removal. Karen, for all her bluster, was finally outnumbered. Faced with mounting evidence and a community that had turned against her, Karen had no choice but to settle. Her lawyer negotiated a deal that would end the case without going to trial, but the terms were steep. Karen agreed to pay $250,000, covering the appraised value of the oak tree, the legal fees I'd incurred, and additional damages for trespassing and destruction of property. She also resigned as HOA president and was barred from holding any HOA position or owning property in the neighborhood for 10 years. When the settlement was finalized, Amber and I felt a mix of relief and vindication. The money couldn't replace the oak tree, but it was a start. What mattered most was that Karen was finally being held accountable for her actions. Within 6 months, Karen had sold her house and moved out of the neighborhood. Her departure was quiet and unceremonious, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd caused. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to a smaller town in Wyoming. Good riddance. After everything settled down, Amber and I turned our attention to the backyard. The stump of the oak was still there, a painful reminder of what we'd lost. But instead of letting it haunt us, we decided to honor the tree's legacy. We hired a local nursery to help us plant a new tree, a young oak, chosen for its resilience and its potential to grow into something just as magnificent as its predecessor. The day we planted it, Amber took a photo of us standing beside it, her hand resting on the thin trunk. "It's not the same," she said softly. But it's a start. I nodded. The experience left scars, but it also taught us a lot. We learned the importance of standing up for what we believed in, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against us. We learned that some people thrive on control and manipulation, but that truth and persistence can prevail in the end. Most of all, we learned that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about growing, adapting, and finding new ways to move forward. The new oak in our backyard isn't just a tree. It's a reminder that even after the storm, life finds a way to begin again.